welcome back to the Shared Practices Podcast. This is another episode of Ask George. And in this episode, we are catering towards the aspiring owners. So anybody who is wanting to get into ownership. And, aspiring owners, I would like to broaden the horizon a little bit too. Yeah, obviously, primarily, this is going to be people who want to get into their first practice. But there's also the segment of the audience that's growing, is a lot of the people that have been with shared practices for a longer period of time a lot of them maybe have graduated to multiple locations. And so there's also this segment of the audience that this episode could apply to if you're thinking about a second. And so, either way, something that we've been hearing a lot from dentists who have been reaching out to us and talking. And, just to be clear with everyone, right, we do what's called a free look. And so anybody who is interested in looking to buy a practice, we offer a free complimentary look where you can send it to us and we can kind of go from there. And in a lot of those conversations, what happens is they have this question or this comment about, I want to be sure I'm building a business, not just creating a job for myself. And, I think that this speaks to what is a greater trend. And I want to highlight the trend, right? So when I started dental school 12 years ago, wow. I mean, to me, that's I like to think of myself as young. And it's getting harder for me to talk to an aspiring owner and feel like I started dental school 12 years ago. So it's been a while and a lot has changed in dentistry since I started, and when I started, I would say that private practice was kind of making that transition from an assumption that everyone would do to private practice has changed. It used to be for everybody. And I would say that when I was going to school, it was DSOs were still kind of the big bad wolf, in the dental industry. And there was still a lot of private, most people would say that they were going to be private practice owners. And then what ended up happening is maybe half of them never ended up becoming private practice owners. And, I think now the narrative has changed where, people in dental school are evaluating different career paths, and there are ways to have financial success with and without ownership. So I think that from my perspective, it really is that, so what I'm getting at is ownership nowadays is no longer a given. And I write it in this book, Dental Moneyball Zero, which will be coming out soon. I write all about how to get into ownership. And I did a lot of research when writing the book. And one of the things that I came up with is this idea that owners are really nowadays more and more entrepreneurial. And so there are less and less dentists becoming practice owners. And so the people that continue to choose private practice are the more entrepreneurial people who want that entrepreneurial challenge, want to build more of a business. And so I find it not a surprise that now we're starting to hear more and more from aspiring owners. We're trying to hear, I want to be sure I'm building a business and not just creating a job for myself. Because I really think that, and I could be wrong here, but I'm making the assumption that the job for yourself style of practice ownership is not as compelling as it used to be, right? DSOs can offer excellent opportunities that rival or beat that, private practice owner who doesn't have, much scale beyond themselves and it's just their own income, like the solo practice owner. I think that that's sort of my read on why we are hearing this more and more. But I do think that there is something to say about the changing landscape. And I think that there's something to say about the people going into private practice nowadays. They are the dentists who very much choose the entrepreneurial and business side more. And I think that is changing a lot because DSOs candidly can offer a lot. And so to choose that, it just requires a different intentionality. And I think that's the biggest thing. And so I'll say that now, building, so there's this really interesting framework, and I want you to think about it this way. So building a business for yourself, what does that mean? What does it really mean? Well, what it means is that you have a business in which other people make you money. Like that's the simplest, most dental specific explanation, right? You could ask this question in many different industries and you'd have many different answers. But dentistry in general is a very HR intensive industry. And so dentistry as a whole is very, very people dependent, right? There is a set number of patients any given person can treat on a given day. And if we want to grow our revenue, that oftentimes requires more people in a linear framework, right? So it's like for every extra, 100,000 or 200,000 in income, we're going to need one additional full-time team member of some type. And it's very people for dollar kind of, that's just kind of dentistry. And so if you really think about it, right, if you're a dentist and you're wanting to build a business, not just create a job for yourself, what you're really saying is I want to build a larger team that treats a lot of patients so that I'm not treating everyone myself and have some component of passive income. Like that's at least how I hear the question. And so I think that if you are, so let me kind of like say that if you are a solo dentist, as much as you can try and you definitely like a solo, like there's two different types of solo dentists, right? There's ones that succeed in a team-led way where they have hygienists who are teeing up treatment for them. They have assistants who are very involved in their legal requirements of how they can make the dentist time more efficient. They have a front office that's very well trained and is really good at case acceptance, new patient phone calls, accounts receivable, all of that. Like a really well-run practice. You can do 1.6, 1.7, up to 2 million, maybe even more for certain folks out of that solo provider practice. Very profitable. But if you ask yourself, am I really building a business or am I creating a job for myself? I would say you're creating a highly leveraged job for yourself. So you are, because you are still required for everything. And I think the step that you take to building a business for yourself is when you're no longer required, right? When you're no longer required, that's the big leap. And so for me, right, like this episode is responding to the common, it's a topic that we are getting on more and more of our calls lately, which is I want to be sure I'm building a business, not just creating a different job for myself. In my opinion, that means multiple dentists, because I really think until you have another provider, you are needed. And if you are needed, then you're not really building a business. You're building a leveraged, excellent job. And there's nothing wrong with that. First of all, before I even get into this, I just want to dispel this connotation and this myth that having a very good job is a bad thing. Like if you are a dentist who does, I call it the 2-over-1, right? If you're the dentist who works 4 days a week and you're doing 1.7, 1.8, 1.9, $2 million, and you have a really highly performing team and you're making a lot of money, nothing is broken. There's nothing wrong with that. You have an excellent job, right? You have ownership, you have equity, you have an income. Great, right? But you didn't build a business that doesn't need you. You built a business that makes the most out of you. And that's where I would draw the distinction between a leveraged job and a business. But that being said, obviously you're still self-employed. You are a business owner, right? So it's the definition can get offensive and people can argue about it. And I'm not really trying to have that debate. I'm really trying to just answer the question for the aspiring owner that wants to feel like they are building something bigger than themselves. And so I would say that for this aspiring owner, right, and this is the aspiring owner that succeeds in the future, is the one that has this mentality, right? Because there are more and more and more dentists every single year who are electing to forego practice ownership. That is the trend. And so that means that there are more dentists working for DSOs, and that also means that there's more dentists who may be unhappy at a DSO looking for a great private practice to work at. So the pool of dentists, so if you remember years and years ago, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of people was finding doctors. And I would say it's still a massive challenge, but there is a growing pool of dentists looking for employment opportunity rather than ownership. And so I think to that dentist who is wanting to build a business with multiple providers, you are that's where the industry is going. The industry is going in a place that has there are dentists that are looking for this more now than there used to be, right? If you think about the 1980s and 90s, But 85% of dentists own their own practice. So if you were a dentist who wanted to own a practice that employed 4 dentists, so yourself and 3 associates, then who were you picking from? You were picking from like 15%. You know what I mean? So it's like 85% own their own practice. Who's going to come work for you? And now we're in a different world where, we're trending towards who knows the numbers, right? I don't even want to speculate, but like, it's definitely not 85-15. It's definitely more like currently probably 70-30, maybe 65-35, maybe in metro areas, 50-50, right? Like it's more and more consolidated, which means that more and more dentists are in that pool of potential associates. So like, that's just what's happening to our industry. And so for the person who is looking to get into ownership to employ other dentists, there's probably never been a better time, except for, we have challenges, and there's tons of challenges. For example, and I just want to say this, the person who is choosing the business side and wants to build that business underneath them are choosing some problems. They are choosing insurance reimbursements. They're choosing high staff costs. They're choosing decreasing margins. They're choosing those challenges. Like, I want to be very clear with the entire audience here. Dentistry has taken a hit post-COVID, a big hit. You are across the country. General dentists are paying more for hygienists and assistants and general inflation than they were before. Like, everyone's staff is making more now than they used to. And, reimbursements haven't caught up to that degree. And so, like, before I paint it as some pretty picture, you're just picking your problems, right? And the person who wants to build a business, they're choosing to tackle those challenges and say, I am going to run an efficient business that generates an income and supersedes those challenges facing general dentists around the country. And good for you. There's absolutely room. There's many examples, right? You've heard on Practice Underwater, right? We have lots of dentists on Practice Underwater, and a lot of them are doing well financially, right? There's plenty of opportunity to be had, but you are picking a certain set of problems. And you're picking the financial stress, you're picking the intelligent decision-making, you're picking staffing, you're picking HR, you're picking leadership, you're picking practice management, growth. You're picking all of those problems rather than picking a busy schedule or high clinical output or any of those other things, right? So you are selecting to have your career focused on some of the other problems that are more non-clinical and more practice management. And so what does that look like? Well, that means that you need at least 2 dentists for an office. And I would say that, honestly, if you were to say like, well, George, like, what's the way of succeeding in the modern day with these higher staff costs and everything like that? It is really about your efficiency. Like, you have got to be efficient, and you have to have multiple providers. I really believe the days in which you can have an associate-led practice with only one dentist. So imagine if this person, the aspiring owner, is like, I want to build a business that doesn't need me. So I'm going to buy 3 4-op practices. I'm going to put 1 full-time dentist in each office, and I'm going to have 3 practices and 3 full-time associates, and I'm not going to work clinically. And I'd say, and you're not going to make money because the economics of a solo practice, associate-led, it gets tough to make it work. So you really need at least 2 doctors worth of revenue to really have enough revenue to have profit after paying the bank for a larger business. So if you are one of those people that wants to build a business, you're really looking at group practice or mega group practice. So that's like 8+ operatories and maybe up to 12, right? That's what you're looking for. And dentistry, definitely at the single site, general dentistry. If you think about general dentistry, right? So let's just go through general dentistry from a margins perspective just for a minute. So if you have an associate who you're paying 30% to, let's just say, clean numbers. You have an associate you're paying 30%. What other costs do you have associated with their dentistry? You have to pay assistants, right? You have to pay supplies. You have to pay lab, right? So maybe call it 15% additional, and then you're at around 45%, right? And then you have that extra 55% from your associates that the business makes. And then with that 55%, it pays for the rent. It pays for the front office team. It pays for, all of your fixed expenses. It pays the bank, right? And then you're like, well, what about the hygienists? Well, the hygienists should pay for themselves, right? The hygienists should produce enough to pay their salaries at least, and then hopefully have a little profit, right? But in the modern day, you have hygienists making $80 an hour, right? So it's like, I think we have to reevaluate how much profitability we're really expecting from hygiene. But nonetheless, like, I think that, so the way to make money in the GP business is, how many of those dentists do you have that are generating 55% profit that then gets used? It's called gross profit. It's like profit that's left the operatory, but still being used to pay sort of the shared costs, like the front office, the rent, the debt service, all of those things. And so, the more dentists you have, so like, for example, let's just say we have a $2 million a year office, and let's just say there's no owner doc in there. It's just 2 associates doing $2 million. Well, you take so then you say, okay, well, what's the cost of doing the $2 million of dentistry? Well, maybe we'd say, okay, it's going to be a little complicated. I'm going to have to make it simpler. Sorry, bad example. So let's say it's a $2.4 million practice, and there's $400,000 of hygiene and then $2 million of doctor production. So that $2 million, you're going to say it's going to cost you around $900,000 to do the $2 million of dentistry. So between the dental assistants, the supplies, the lab, and the associate compensation, you're going to be paying around $450,000 per million, right? So $900,000 for $2 million. And then you have $1.1 million left to pay for your rent, to pay for your marketing, to pay for your debt service, to pay for your front office team, to pay for your office manager, to pay for all of your recurring subscriptions, to pay for all of your expenses, right? That's what you're going to have. Now let's add another dentist. Let's add $3 million of doctor production. Now you have an extra amount of $550,000 to pay towards these things, right? So what I'm getting at is, in the general practice business, the way that you have profit without you is through volume. It's through volume and efficiency. So I'm efficient, I generate a high volume, I have good margin control, and I do that through multiple providers. And so, like, I would say that where a lot of the success is being had right now is the 3 full-time dentist practice. 3 full-time dentists, you get to that point where you cross that threshold, because the more dentists you have and the more dentist production you have, the more margin you have, and you don't scale your expenses at that same rate. So you can actually dilute your expenses and increase your profitability. And so that's really like where the business is. So if I'm an aspiring owner and I'm wanting to build a business, not just create a job for myself, what I'm really saying is, okay, what type of practice can I have 2 associates at least? And that's going to be starting to build a real business, because a real business is defined as, from my mind, is like, I have the option to one day step out of this business and have it still be an asset that's paying me monthly. That's like my threshold. And, different definitions, right? There's 100 different ways to define what's a real, like, building a business. But I would say that for the aspiring owner, that should be what you're targeting. And then your clinical production. So then let's just use the example of I don't want to go non-clinical. I like doing dentistry, which is most dentists, and that should be most dentists. Then I would say that 2 full-time dentists allow you to work 2 to 3 days a week doing your favorite procedures. And guess what? You're going to have a 10 to 15% profit margin on all of the dentistry that you don't do. And then you're going to take home 85% of the dentistry you do, right? So that's kind of the value prop, is even for the person who wants to be clinical, who still wants to build that business, what they're really building is they're building passive income, and then they're building the ability for their production to be even more profitable. And so, like, my favorite business model ever is the combination of a great job for yourself and building a business, which is like a $3 million practice with 2.5 doctors, 2 full-time associates, and an owner doctor who works half-time doing their favorite procedures, whether that's heavily ortho, heavily implant, maybe heavily endo, maybe sleep. There's lots of different ways to skin that cat. But I find that to be the best setup, because, like, there's this one guy that I've chatted with, and he talked about how he does full mouth rehabs and cosmetics. And it's like he does full mouth rehabs and cosmetics, and then his associates do everything else. And also implants. It's like implants, cosmetics, and full mouth rehab. And it's like they kind of refer those cases. He does those, and then, they do the rest. Sedation is also another popular one, right? It's like your associates refer you sedations. You do sedations all day. You do that 2 days a week. Those are big cases. They make good money. And then you do sedation dentistry 2 days a week. You have a really high margin on that. And then you have, $2.5 million that's done by the practice, not you, between the two doctors and the hygienists. And on that, you make, $300,000 or so. And so you have $300,000 that you make from everyone else, and then you make 85% of your production on your sedation. So it's like there's lots of different ways to do that. But I think the gist, and heading towards the aspiring owner, is you need to look for a facility that has enough operatories to grow to that level. You also then need to look for a ready-to-grow practice. We talk about ready-to-grow a lot. Dental Moneyball Zero is your roadmap to find a ready-to-grow practice. So when that book comes out, you buy the book and you read it. It's very long. It goes into a lot of depth, and it explains this. But essentially, you're buying a practice with a large overdue recare base. Because really, it's a function of, do I have the facility? Do I have the correct number of operatories? Do I have the correct number of team members? Do I have the correct number of assistants, hygienists, front office, all of the things? And do I have the correct amount of patients? And if I have the correct number of team members, the correct number of operatories, the correct number of dentists, and the correct number of team members or of patients, then you've got what it needs to happen, right? So when you are an aspiring owner who is looking to put yourself in a situation where you're building a business, I would say put yourself in a situation where you can have 2 associates working for you. And that could either be 2 associates working for you and you're any degree of clinical in which you'd like. So if you wanted 8 ops, then those 2 associates probably only work in 1 to 2 days a week. Like you're not going to be able to fit in a whole lot more. Right? So if you're looking at an 8 operatory practice, the facility is going to be the constraint. Where if you have 2 dentists working 4 days a week each, maybe one is Monday through Thursday, the second one's Tuesday through Friday, then, or maybe like you're probably going to want them both on Friday. So you're not going to want to work Friday. So you might have one like Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and the other one Tuesday through Friday. And then you might work, maybe Monday, Wednesday, right? And then you have 2 doctors every day, and there's 2.5 doctors. But that's like 8 ops is going to be your constricting element. You're not going to be able to add a 3rd full-time dentist. So like the facility is going to be one of your constraints. The patient base is going to be another one of your constraints. If you look at a practice and you're like, wow, there's like 1,200 patients here. You're like, okay, well, if I want to be like have 2 associates, then it's going to be kind of tough for me to get that number of patients. I'm going to need like 2,600, 2,800 patients for that. And so you say, wow, like I'd have to more than double the size of this patient base. That's going to take a long time, right? So you probably don't want to buy that practice. You want to buy one with like 2,200 patients and then grow it from there. And so the patient base is going to be a big one. And then staffing is surprisingly becoming an increasing challenge. So one of the other challenges that practice owners are taking on today is staffing. Like finding people to work is going to be challenging. And I would even say that in the bigger cities, you have the patient. So like staffing is surprisingly not a whole lot easier in big cities. You would think like if you're in a rural area, you'd be like, man, I wish I lived in big market. You put out an ad and you see all these people. But the job market in big cities is like really flaky. And people go from one opportunity to the next and they kind of job hop. And so you end up having more turnover and replacing people. Like in a more rural area, there's less options. So people tend to stay longer. So it's like a different semblance of a staffing problem, but then you don't have as much dental experience. You might have to get people outside of dental and train them. So it's like, don't think that if you're rural, semi-rural, or in urban area or metro area, like everyone's having staffing challenges. It just looks different depending on where you are. But I would say that like really the way that you run your practice and how efficient you are is incredibly important in a major market, because major markets have higher rent, they have more marketing costs, and they have higher staff costs. So like if I'm trying to build a business that kicks off cash and I'm not required as much in a major market, there are very real challenges facing you. And it's mainly the marketing spend, the rent, the team costs, like those three things, that's 10% right there, right? A little nicking here and there, and all of a sudden you've lost 10% of your profit, or 10% of your revenue that was profit, now it's not. So I think that is just something else to keep in mind as well. And so really at the end of the day, to kind of summate this episode, if you are either an owner of an existing practice who wants to get another practice and have it be more of a business rather than something that you are producing in clinically, or if you are one of the, what I would call the modern avatar of, in the book that I'm writing, Dental Moneyball Zero, the last chapter is called The New Era Dental Entrepreneur. So I would say like the new era dental entrepreneur is one who's like really intentional about wanting the business problems. And I would say that if you are that era, you should really look at trying to get into a situation where you can have 2 full-time associates one day. I would say that is going to be sort of my 2 full-time associates or more. That would be my barometer in the modern day on when do you start to cross that Rubicon from a job to a business, is when you have 2 full-time associates. And it used to be 1 full-time associate, but the problem is, our margins have shrunk. It just is what's happened post-COVID. And I'm sure there's some person out there who's like, that's too doom and gloom. I'm doing great. It hasn't affected me. It's like, yeah, well, I'm talking to thousands of people. So I have to speak in generalities and trends. And over thousands of dentists, post-COVID, thousands of dentists are less profitable. And so I would say post-COVID in the modern day, I think you're really looking at 2 full-time associates before it really starts to be a really attractive proposition to have that significant passive income because of what I talked about, right? By the time you pay the associate 30%, you pay 10% to supplies and lab, maybe pay 5% to assistants, then you are assistants in front, whatever, like you are 55% of that is profit that then gets used to pay for other stuff. You got to pay for all that other stuff and then it's profit, right? So you need more of those, you need more of that coming through, it's called gross profit, more of that gross profit coming through so that it really makes a whole lot of sense to absentee own or even to work part-time and have a real business that doesn't need you there every day, generates enough cash to justify its existence, and allows you the lifestyle that you might want. And so I would say that this is like the multiple providers in a single office is the future of private practice as far as I'm concerned, because I think that the solo dentist is getting squeezed out a bit. And yeah, obviously I'm wrong when I'm talking about everyone in generalities. There's many people who are making tons of money this way, right? There's many dentists doing 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 million as solo dentists making great incomes. And I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the dentist doing 900,000 by themselves, right? Like that becomes a decreasing, just every year that passes, the staff costs, like paying your assistant $6 an hour more than you were 5 years ago, like that's going to affect that person a whole lot. And, I think that that's kind of where the industry is going. And so really, if you want to build that business for yourself, you really need to design everything to have 2 associates full-time one day. And I would say that means that your facility, your patient base, your team, and the number of doctors all need to be sort of rowing in that same direction. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Shared Practices podcast. We got this topic from people who have reached out to us with common concerns that sort of informed what to tell the audience or what the audience wants to hear. And so if there's something that you want to hear us talk about, team@sharedpractices.com. Send an email and talk about what you'd like us to talk about on the podcast. And we may feature that topic in the future episode of Ask George. So thanks for listening to another episode of Ask George, and I'll see you again on the Shared Practices podcast. Thanks for listening in our 10th full year of releasing episodes. Thanks for listening again to the Shared Practices podcast.